Have you ever had one of those situations, where you think you're just going about your normal business and then suddenly everything goes completely sideways? Like
Yeah.
just a totally routine thing turns into a nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. I think we've all had those moments where we feel like we're losing control, you know? Things spiral out of control and it's terrifying.
Yeah, exactly. And that feeling of helplessness, right? Well, that's what we're exploring today. The story of a routine trip to the U.S. border that turned into a truly harrowing ordeal.
A deep dive.
Exactly, a deep dive. We're going to delve into the experience of Jasmine Mooney, a Canadian actress and entrepreneur.
She was, well, this whole thing took place in early March 2025.
Right, March 2025.
Mm.
And to get a complete picture, we've pulled together a whole range of sources. We have news reports, interviews with Jasmine and her family, and even Jasmine's own firsthand account of what happened.
A really powerful account, by the way. I mean, just reading her words, you can sense the shock and the fear she went through.
It's really unsettling. So let's set the scene. Jasmine travels to the U.S.-Mexico border, specifically the San Isidro port of entry. That's a major crossing point in California, right across from Tijuana. She was there to renew her U.S. work visa. Pretty standard stuff.
Yeah, a routine process, something she'd actually done before without any problems.
But this time, things went very, very differently. She ended up being detained by IEE.
ICE, for anyone who's not familiar, stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're the federal agency in the U.S. responsible for enforcing immigration laws.
So this wasn't a case of someone trying to enter the country illegally or anything like that.
No, not at all.
Jasmine was following all the established procedures, trying to renew her visa through the proper channels.
And she had all her documentation in order.
Exactly. Her valid Canadian passport, no criminal record, and a new job offer lined up in the States. Everything was legit.
On paper, a completely straightforward renewal.
But then she was detained, held for a shocking 2 weeks.
It's a truly disturbing situation, and what makes it even more unsettling is that it seems to have happened without any clear cause. No explanation, no charges filed, just detention.
It really makes you think about the power dynamics at play in these kinds of situations, right?
Absolutely. You know, the vulnerability of individuals when they're interacting with these large bureaucratic systems.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're aiming to understand with this deep dive.
Hmm.
We want to go beyond the headlines, beyond the legal jargon, and really explore the human impact of this kind of experience. What does it actually feel like to have your freedom taken away, to be held against your will without any explanation?
That's the core of it.
So let's rewind a bit. Before all of this went down, what was Jasmine's mindset? Was she expecting any trouble with the renewal, especially considering she'd done this before?
Well, she was cautiously optimistic, I'd say, but not completely at ease either. There was definitely some underlying anxiety.
That makes sense. I mean, crossing an international border, there's always that little bit of uncertainty.
Right. And in Jasmine's case, that anxiety was heightened by a previous experience she'd had with U.S. Customs and Border Protection.
CBP.
Yeah, CBP, the officers you first encounter at ports of entry. A few months before this trip, Jasmine had had a really negative encounter with a CBP officer.
What happened?
Well, it was over a really minor paperwork issue, something about the letterhead on one of her documents not being quite right. It was a technicality, really.
But it was enough for them to revoke her visa.
Exactly. She had to return to Canada and start the entire visa application process from scratch. So even though she was meticulously prepared this time around, that previous experience had definitely left its mark.
Like a scar, almost. Once you've had a negative experience with a system like that, it's hard to shake the feeling that it could happen again.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And to add to her apprehension, her immigration lawyer had warned her about the current political climate, saying that border crossings could be unpredictable.
Even though she'd successfully obtained a visa at San Isidro before.
Right, which just goes to show that there's always an element of uncertainty when it comes to these things.
So she crosses into Tijuana on March 3, 2025, heads to the U.S. checkpoint at San Isidro with this mix of hope and apprehension.
And when she initially interacted with the CBP officers, there was a sense of confusion right from the start.
Oh, what happened?
Well, they reviewed her case and suggested that maybe she needed to apply for the visa through a U.S. consulate rather than at the border. It wasn't the process she had anticipated, but at this point, she wasn't overly concerned.
She was willing to adapt, to follow whatever procedure they deemed necessary.
Exactly. She was prepared to go back to Canada and apply through the consulate if that was the right way to do it. One of the officers even told her, "You didn't do anything wrong. You are not a criminal."
Which, in hindsight, is a really odd thing to say, considering what happened next.
It is, isn't it? But at that moment, it probably provided a bit of reassurance to Jasmine. She actually sat down in the border office and started looking at flights back to Vancouver, thinking she'd just have to reschedule her plans.
She had no idea what was about to unfold.
So none whatsoever.
And then, out of the blue, everything changed.
Yeah. Without any warning, a male officer approached her and simply said, "Come with me."
Just like that. Come with me.
Yeah.
No explanation, no opportunity to ask questions.
Nothing.
And Jasmine's own words really capture the suddenness and the shock of that moment. She said, I was literally just taken.
Taken. It's such a powerful word, and it really conveys that sense of being completely powerless.
So what happened next? What were those first few moments after she was taken into custody like?
It was a rapid sequence of events. They immediately seized all of her belongings.
Her phone, her wallet, everything.
Everything. She was ordered to face a wall and then subjected to a pat-down. It's the kind of treatment you might expect if you were suspected of a serious crime.
But she had done nothing wrong.
Right. And she was trying to understand what was happening, to ask for an explanation, but it was just a barrage of commands.
Overwhelming and disorienting.
Exactly. And then came the words that truly sent a chill down her spine. You are being detained.
Just like that, she was a detainee.
Yeah.
No explanation, no indication of how long she would be held.
When she asked those very questions, the only response she got was, I don't know.
Chilling. Just imagine that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
1 minute you're dealing with a bureaucratic hiccup, the next you're being told you're being detained with no idea why or for how long.
It's a complete loss of control.
And she had no way to contact a lawyer or even let her family know what was happening.
She was completely isolated, and her own words really capture the terror of that moment. She said, I felt like I had been kidnapped.
Kidnapped. It's a strong word, but it really conveys the sense of violation and fear.
Absolutely.
So she's taken into custody at the San Ysidro border facility. What were those initial hours and days of detention like for her? What were the conditions? How was she treated?
The picture that emerges from the sources is pretty grim. She was taken to a holding cell.
What was it like?
Well, stark and incredibly uncomfortable. She was given a thin mat to sleep on and, unbelievably, a sheet of aluminum foil as a blanket.
A sheet of aluminum foil?
Well, that's right. When she asked a guard about it, the response was simply, your blanket.
It's hard to believe that's considered adequate in a situation like that.
Especially in a cold concrete cell with harsh fluorescent lights that were never turned off. And she wasn't alone in that cell. There were other women there also wrapped in these foil blankets, lying on thin mats. Jasmine described them as looking like dead bodies in that constant, eerie light.
A chilling image.
It is. 2 days and nights she spent in that hilera, which translates to icebox.
Disoriented, cold, with no sense of time because of the relentless lighting.
And no information. None of the officials would tell her why she was being held or when she might be released.
The uncertainty must have been agonizing.
Absolutely. And the other women in the cell mainly spoke languages she didn't understand, so there wasn't even the comfort of conversation.
Just isolation.
To cope, she tried to meditate, to find some inner peace amidst the chaos. And she actually refused most of the food they offered, hoping that her detention would be short-lived.
That sliver of hope, right? Clinging to the belief that it'll all be over soon.
Exactly. And then finally, on the third day, they allowed her a brief phone call.
A lifeline to the outside world.
Yes, but the only number she could remember was her best friend Brittany's back in Vancouver.
Imagine the relief of hearing a familiar voice after days of silence and uncertainty.
I know. It must have been incredibly emotional. She tried to explain her situation, but she still didn't understand why she was being held or when she might be released. But that call was crucial. It alerted Brittany and Jasmine's family that something was seriously wrong.
The first step in the fight to get her back.
Right. And then Jasmine was transferred to a different facility.
To where?
The ICE Detention Center in Otay Mesa.
That sounds more permanent, more serious. What was it like there?
It was a larger facility surrounded by barbed wire. And the intake process was very much like being processed into a prison.
Dehumanizing.
Yeah. They issued her a uniform, fingerprinted her, took her through a medical check. It all felt very surreal, very unsettling. And when she finally asked how long she would be detained, the answer she got was devastating. Could be days, could be weeks, months.
Just crushing uncertainty.
It was. Jasmine said she felt like she was going to throw up.
The thought of potentially being held for months with no end in sight, It's hard to even fathom.
And then they placed her in a unit with dozens of other women.
Were the conditions any better there?
Well, there was one small comfort: real blankets.
No more aluminum foil.
No more aluminum foil. She actually described that as the best part of that unit.
After days in the freezing cold, a real blanket must have felt like an incredible luxury.
It must have. But the fundamental hardships remained. The lack of control, the lack of information, the fear. And there were concerns about the drinking water, which seemed questionable at best.
Unsanitary conditions.
Potentially. There were also concerns about the food. Some of the detainees were reportedly getting sick from eating it. And then there's the psychological impact of the constant bright lights, the cold temperatures, and that ongoing lack of information.
It all wears you down, doesn't it?
It does. But amidst all of that, Jasmine found some solace in connecting with the other women detained there.
A sense of community in a really difficult situation.
Exactly. And she discovered that most of them had no criminal history at all.
They were just caught up in the system.
Yeah. People dealing with visa issues, immigration backlogs, often just trying to navigate a complex and confusing process. She heard their stories, families that had been separated, lives that had been completely disrupted. She mentioned a mother who was crying for her children and a professional who had overstayed her visa while trying to get her status sorted out.
Heartbreaking.
It is. And hearing those stories gave Jasmine a sense of perspective, a feeling that she wasn't alone in this.
It's a reminder that behind all the statistics and the headlines, there are real people facing incredibly difficult circumstances.
Absolutely. And they formed a sort of community within those walls, offering each other comfort and support. There was even a moment when a group of women from different backgrounds came together to pray for Jasmine's release.
A moment of humanity in a really dehumanizing situation.
Yes. And then another sudden and unsettling development: a transfer in the middle of the night.
After she'd started to adjust to Otay Mesa.
Right. At 3 a.m., they were woken up and told to pack their things. Jasmine thought maybe this was it. Maybe she was finally being released.
A glimmer of hope.
But when she asked where they were going, the officer's response was, "I don't know."
Just another layer of uncertainty and fear.
It was. They were being transferred to a facility in Arizona.
The journey itself sounds awful. 5 hours on a bus, shackled.
She was shackled at the waist, wrists, and ankles for almost 24 hours straight.
Degrading and inhumane.
It is. And when they arrived at the San Luis Regional Detention Center in Arizona, they had to go through the whole intake process again.
Like entering prison for a second time.
Exactly. And sadly, the conditions in Arizona were reportedly even worse than what she'd experienced in California.
It's hard to imagine it getting worse.
She was placed in a single large concrete room with no windows, constant fluorescent lighting, a thin blanket, and no pillow. It was freezing cold, and there were dozens of women in there, all sleeping shoulder to shoulder on thin mats. She described them as looking like a room full of corpses.
A haunting image.
It is. 50 women sharing one toilet, barely any soap, tiny hand towels, and having to reuse the same styrofoam cup and plastic spoon for every meal.
It sounds designed to strip away any sense of dignity.
That's exactly how Jasmine felt. She compared it to a sick psychological experiment.
But even in those conditions, the sense of solidarity among the women remained.
It did. They were all facing similar hardships, and that shared experience continued to offer some comfort.
Strength in numbers.
Yes. But for Jasmine, the mental strain was taking its toll. She kept telling herself, "Don't let this break you." And she was desperately worried about her family, not knowing if they even knew where she was.
And it was at this point that a bit of luck, or maybe fate, intervened.
Right. Another detainee showed her the email tablet.
A way to connect with the outside world.
Yes. Against all odds, Jasmine remembered her company's CEO's email address and managed to send him a message explaining her situation.
And he responded.
He did. And that single email opened a channel of communication. She was finally able to get in touch with Brittany and let everyone know where she was being held.
That must have been a huge relief.
It was. Meanwhile, her family and friends back in Canada were doing everything they could to get her released.
What were they doing?
Well, her mother, Alexis, took to Facebook, sharing details about Jasmine's ordeal and pleading for help. She called the conditions inhumane and deeply concerning.
Trying to raise awareness.
Exactly. Her father was working with Canadian officials trying to navigate the bureaucratic maze. He even bought her a plane ticket home, not knowing when she would actually be able to use it. And there was this agonizing moment of false hope when the online detainee locator showed her as released. It turned out she was just being transferred to Arizona. But for 24 hours, they had no idea where she was.
Just excruciating.
It was. And Brittany was absolutely relentless in her efforts to get Jasmine released. She was contacting everyone she could think of: journalists, government officials, immigration lawyers. She was highlighting the injustice of the situation, pointing out that Jasmine was a law-abiding citizen who was being detained without cause. She even tipped off an investigative news team.
Which proved to be a crucial move.
It was.
Because it led to that incredibly powerful video call between Jasmine and a TV news crew.
Right. Using another detainee's phone, Jasmine was able to speak directly to the news, describing the horrific conditions she was enduring.
A first-hand account from inside the detention center.
Exactly. She talked about being up for 24 hours wrapped in chains and called the whole experience inhumane.
And those images of her wearing a detention jumpsuit saying, "I feel like we have been kidnapped," they really captured the public's attention.
They did. And with that increased media scrutiny, the pressure on the authorities mounted.
Her family, her friends, the public, even the Canadian government were all demanding her release.
Global Affairs Canada issued a statement expressing their concern about the situation. And finally, after 12 long days, Jasmine was told she was being released.
Just like that?
Pretty much. But even the release process itself lacked basic human decency.
What do you mean?
Well, she was transferred back to San Diego at 2 in the morning, still in shackles.
Seriously?
Yeah. And when they arrived at the airport, there were members of the press waiting. The officers actually hurried her through a side door to avoid the cameras seeing her in chains.
Trying to avoid bad publicity.
I guess so. But there was one small act of kindness. The two officers who were escorting her were actually quite nice. They made some jokes, and Jasmine said it was the first time she had genuinely laughed in weeks.
A little bit of humanity amidst the dehumanization.
Yes. And then, finally, she was on a plane back to Vancouver.
Must have felt surreal.
It did. She arrived after midnight, greeted by her family, friends, and a crowd of media. She was visibly exhausted, pale, had lost weight. Her voice was weak as she spoke to the reporters. She said she was still processing everything, hadn't slept or eaten properly, and felt numb.
A mix of relief and lingering trauma.
Absolutely. And then learning about all the efforts that had been made to secure her release, the support from her family, Brittany, the media, she was incredibly grateful.
It's a reminder of the power of community, of people coming together to fight for what's right.
And it's important to remember that she was never charged with any crime. To this day, she still doesn't know why she was detained.
No explanation.
None. And she has spoken out about the dehumanizing conditions she endured. The chains, the sleepless transfers, the inadequate food, the constant cold. That feeling of having been kidnapped has stayed with her.
A lasting scar.
It is. But she's been careful to direct her criticism at the immigration enforcement system, not at America as a whole.
Making that distinction.
Yes. And she's also aware of how fortunate she was to have a Canadian passport, resources, and a strong support network.
Not everyone has those advantages.
Exactly. She said, imagine what this system is like for every other person in there.
A powerful statement.
It is. And she now feels a responsibility to share the stories of the other detainees she met, to give voice to those who are often silenced.
Amplifying their experiences.
Yes.
And the public and media reaction to Jasmine's story was significant, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There was huge public outcry and extensive media coverage, both in Canada and the U.S. Headlines focused on the Canadian actress detained by IC and used her own words, like literally just taken, and I feel like I've been kidnapped.
Yeah.
Photos of her distressed face and her tearful reunion with her loved ones were circulated widely.
A very visual story.
It was. And in Canada, public sentiment was overwhelmingly in support of Jasmine. It became a major talking point, raising concerns about the unpredictability of U.S. border crossings. Premier David Eby even called the situation terrible and urged the federal government to take action. Online, there was a lot of outrage, with many people using the word inhumane to describe her treatment.
Echoing her mother's words.
Exactly. And the media coverage spanned a wide range of outlets, from initial news reports to in-depth interviews and Jasmine's own firsthand account, which she published in The Guardian.
Giving her a platform to share her story.
Yes. IC did issue a statement about her detention, but it didn't really resonate with the public. The general feeling was that she had been a victim of a system that was out of control. Immigration experts weighed in, criticizing her detention as an excessive response and an example of increasingly harsh enforcement measures.
So it became a bigger conversation about immigration policy and human rights.
It did. And social media became a space for people to share their own experiences, to express support for Jasmine, and to engage in broader discussions about the ethical implications of immigration detention.
Her story became a catalyst for a much larger debate.
It did.
Jasmine Mooney's ordeal is a stark reminder of the very real human cost of immigration policies and enforcement practices. The fear, the dehumanization, the lasting trauma. It's a story that stays with you.
It does. And it makes you think about the power of these systems and the importance of ensuring due process and humane treatment for everyone, regardless of their citizenship or circumstances.
What does Jasmine's story reveal about the human cost of these policies?
It's a question worth pondering.
We encourage you to share your thoughts on this topic.
And if you have any suggestions for future deep dives, please let us know.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.